President-elect Donald Trump is not playing nice with Mexico and Canada, the closest allies of the United States and closest neighbors too. The media is simply shocked at the most recent utterances of Trump regarding these two countries. But no one is sure why Trump is sticking to making the most controversial proposals about Mexico and Canada, even going as far as saying they should be part of the states of the US and not independent countries.
President-elect trolling the Canadian government, maybe disrespecting, maybe just thinking of Canada or Prime Minister Trudeau as a joke. I'm not sure. Why might he be doing this?
This is not the only ripple Trump is causing. Across the Pacific, Russia seems to be in for a hard time because the United States just proposed more sanctions against Russian oil and gas, a move that is likely being considered ahead of Trump's inauguration. Meanwhile, on the Chinese front, Beijing is talking about cutting down drone supplies to Ukraine. If this ban is implemented, it would be a big blow to Zelensky, as drone warfare has been the advantage the Ukrainians have had since the beginning of the war. These and more will be discussed in this video. But first, let's talk about the rough start Mexico and Canada are having with Trump. In December 2024, President-elect Donald Trump made controversial remarks suggesting that Canada and Mexico should consider becoming U.S. states. He justified this idea by claiming that the U.S. heavily subsidizes these neighboring countries to the tune of $100 billion for Canada and $300 billion for Mexico annually. Trump linked these subsidies to trade imbalances and issues such as illegal immigration, threatening hefty tariffs on both nations if they failed to address U.S. concerns. These comments ignited debates about sovereignty, trade relations, and the broader implications of such proposals. Is it okay for a president to make such threats to other nations? Ontario's Premier Doug Ford has responded to Trump's threats and says his province is ready to respond by cutting off power supply to the United States.
You come and attack Ontario, you attack livelihoods of people of Ontario and Canadians. We're going to use every tool in our toolbox to defend Ontarians and Canadians across the border.
You see, Ontario is a key player in the North American energy grid, exporting a substantial amount of electricity to the U.S., particularly to neighboring states like New York and Michigan. Much of this power comes from hydroelectric and nuclear sources, making it not only reliable but also relatively clean. Cutting off this supply could destabilize energy prices, create shortages, and strain the U.S. grid. The impact would depend on the scale of the disruption and the preparedness of the affected U.S. states to source alternative energy. While it's true that Ontario has leverage in this area, such a move could also backfire economically by reducing the province's revenue from energy exports and straining cross-border relations. Interestingly, Doug may be on his own because most other province premiers do not agree to sanctioning the United States. Provinces like Quebec, Manitoba, and British Columbia, which are also significant players in electricity exports to the U.S., would likely oppose such a drastic move for several reasons. One such example is Danielle Smith of Alberta Province.
From the Alberta perspective, under no circumstances will Alberta agree to cut off oil and gas exports.
Quebec, known for its hydroelectric power, is the largest electricity exporter to the U.S. It shares strong economic ties with American states like New York and Vermont, with long-term contracts that generate billions of dollars in revenue. Quebec Premier François Legault would likely argue that disrupting power exports would damage Quebec's economy, harm its reputation as a reliable energy partner, and jeopardize its lucrative agreements. Legault might also emphasize the cooperative nature of Canada-US energy relations. Quebec has historically taken a more diplomatic approach to cross-border tensions, preferring negotiation over confrontation. Legault's perspective could highlight the dangers of politicizing energy exports, which are often seen as a stabilizing force in international relations. The US and Canada share one of the most integrated energy relationships in the world, with electricity, oil, and gas flowing freely across the border under agreements like the USMCA, which has benefited both countries. Any disruption would likely lead to broader economic and diplomatic consequences, potentially sparking retaliation. Trump's threats, whether related to tariffs, trade policies, or another issue, are likely prompting Ford to make this statement as a show of strength. However, cutting off electricity would be a drastic measure that is not just realistic for Canada. According to Trump, it is the United States that is benefiting Canada by giving the country subsidies, and he thinks this arrangement is unfair to the United States.
Well, that's okay if he does that, that's fine, but the United States is subsidizing Canada. It's truly a subsidy.
Ford's statement is as much a political maneuver as it is a practical warning. It appeals to domestic audiences by framing Ontario as a strong, independent entity capable of standing up to the U.S. However, Ford is also backtracking on his statements. He is already talking about finding a fair ground with the U.S., which simply sounds like he has realized that he can't carry out sanctions against the United States. But it is not just Canadian officials that are responding. The Mexican president has responded too. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum has taken a firm stance against Donald Trump's recent threats to impose a 25% tariff on Mexican exports. She criticized the approach, stating that addressing issues like migration and drug consumption requires collaboration rather than forceful measures. She warned that such tariffs could harm shared economic interests, including industries like automotive manufacturing, which significantly benefit both countries. She emphasized the mutual risks, including potential inflation and job losses on both sides of the border. Sheinbaum also pointed to the shared responsibility in challenges such as the trafficking of fentanyl and illegal firearms, highlighting that many weapons seized in Mexico originate from the United States. In response, she vowed that any tariffs imposed by Trump would be met with equivalent countermeasures. She also expressed her intention to seek diplomatic dialogue with Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to avoid escalating tensions. But even more interesting is how Trump's statements are causing political tensions in Canada. The Conservative leader of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, criticized Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for being a weak leader.
Well, while I'm a critic of Mr. Trudeau's, I did feel badly that he went in with such a position of weakness.
In November 2024, after Donald Trump threatened to impose sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau traveled to Florida for a direct meeting at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort. It was this move that Pierre Poilievre criticizes as weakness because it showed that Trudeau was scared and lacked the power to negotiate. While Canada and Mexico try to find a way of dealing with Trump without creating a bigger mess, Russia is also frustrated with actions of the United States against it. U.S. proposes new sanctions on Russian oil. The Biden administration is deliberating on imposing stricter sanctions against Russia's oil trade. These sanctions, which are aimed at crippling the Kremlin's war chest and ending the conflict in Ukraine, may have unintended consequences that could ripple across the globe. While the move appears to be a show of force by the outgoing administration, it proves the persistent challenges of weaponizing economic tools in a highly interconnected global energy market. The question is not whether these sanctions can hurt Russia, but whether they might hurt everyone else even more, and whether they will work as intended at all. Sanctions targeting Russia's energy exports are not new. Since February 2022, the United States and its allies have employed a series of measures, including bans on oil imports and a price cap on Russian crude. These steps were designed to reduce Moscow's revenues without destabilizing global energy markets. However, their success has been mixed at best. Russia has expertly maneuvered around many of these restrictions. For instance, its crude oil exports, though banned in Europe and the US, have found eager buyers in Asia. Countries like China and India, undeterred by Western sanctions, have ramped up their purchases of Russian oil, often at discounted prices. Moscow's so-called shadow fleet of tankers, vessels operating under opaque ownership with questionable insurance, has further facilitated these sales. Meanwhile, the Group of Seven G7 price cap, set at $60 per barrel, has struggled to achieve its objectives. While it limits Western services for Russian oil sold above the cap, many shipments bypass this mechanism altogether. The reality is that Russia has continued to earn substantial revenue, often exceeding the cap, all while avoiding the severe economic collapse some had predicted. Are the sanctions in any way working, or is the US issuing them just to act tough? These questions cannot be answered directly because the effect has been both ways. Besides, Europe still needs Russian gas, and in cases where they abandon the Kremlin's supply for other sources such as gas from the United States, they have had to pay more. In the end, we have to ask who is paying the price for these sanctions. One of the key concerns remains the risk of disrupting oil supplies and driving up global prices. The Biden administration, while now taking a tougher stance, previously avoided sanctions on Russian oil exports precisely because of this threat. Energy markets are extremely sensitive, and even the hint of reduced supply can trigger a price surge. After Russia's invasion, oil prices soared above $130 per barrel, but later stabilized below 75 balance. However, a new round of sanctions could easily reverse this trend, dealing a blow to the global economy and increasing pressure on governments, including the US, which are already grappling with challenges stemming from rising fuel costs. The risk extends to diplomatic relations as well. India and China, the largest buyers of Russian oil, are unlikely to comply with sanctions that threaten their energy security. Excessive pressure on these nations could strain relations at a time when their cooperation is crucial for controlling technology exports and maintaining regional stability. Even Europe, despite reducing its reliance on Russian energy, remains vulnerable. Global price spikes could significantly impact the region's economy, and countries like Hungary and Turkey have already voiced concerns over the potential fallout from stricter sanctions. Russia's economy, while facing serious difficulties, has avoided collapse. High defense spending and support for domestic businesses have sustained its resilience. According to Bloomberg, the country is even expected to see economic growth of 3.9% in 2024. However, beneath this apparent stability lie deeper issues, including inflation exceeding 8% and a central bank interest rate of 21%. While all these are happening, China is also making its own moves, but this time the target is Ukraine. China upsets Ukraine's drone program. China has made a decision to restrict drone supplies critical to Ukraine's war effort. This reflects a multifaceted strategy rooted in its geopolitical priorities, economic leverage, and broader policy goals. By cutting exports of drone components such as motors, batteries, and flight controllers, Beijing signals its dissatisfaction with Western policies and its intention to assert its position in the international arena. From China's perspective, these restrictions serve multiple purposes. First, they align with its ongoing efforts to counter US and European sanctions targeting Chinese companies and technologies. By leveraging its dominance in global drone manufacturing, accounting for over 80% of global supply with DJI having 76% of global supply, China is strategically demonstrating its influence over essential supply chains, including those with dual civilian and military applications. This move also serves as a response to US arms sales to Taiwan, which Beijing views as a direct challenge to its sovereignty. China's broader objective likely includes reshaping global trade dynamics. The export controls highlight the risks of dependency on Chinese supply chains, particularly for advanced technologies. By restricting key components, Beijing is pressuring Western powers to reconsider their reliance on Chinese-manufactured goods, even as it prompts affected nations to diversify their sources, which is a costly and time-intensive process. What is happening right now is a series of power plays among nations, with the United States at the center of it all. Every nation strives to be respected and taken seriously. More importantly, what seems to be happening is that everyone is positioning themselves in anticipation of Trump's presidency. Sanctions and tariffs have become the most common tools of negotiation, despite their damaging effects on the countries imposing them. How will Trump respond to these strategic power moves? At this point, it appears he is likely to double down on his rhetoric. If you found this breakdown helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and stick around for more updates on how the global economy is evolving. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.